I said this in the first service, and it's no less true in this one. Everyone wants to talk more about what you were talking about, Alan, and they don't want to hear what I have to say. So Alan will be out in the patio afterwards. You're welcome to talk to any of our elders. We are happy to engage conversation. We know that there's a lot of issues, a lot of questions, a lot of things that come up in our lives that are challenging. And so we want to be able to walk those through, talk those through, hear, interact, and most of all, point everyone to our understanding of Scripture. So we do invite that conversation. Give me just a second here. I'm a little discombobulated. You definitely want me to do this. So a couple of bits of housekeeping. Yes, it's hot in here. The 10% of you that are like, this is awesome, I wish it was always that way, please keep an eye on the other 90% to make sure they don't pass out. We've turned the air conditioning on, that doesn't do anything. We've turned the heater off, and that doesn't do anything either. So, welcome. I don't know what's going on, but that's all right. And for those of you that are online, enjoy the comfort of wherever you are right now and pray for us. We're in Daniel chapter 11. And today is long and arduous in one sense, so let me get your help on the front end, and I will help you as well. We're going to go through this chapter. We're going to go through all of the chapter. I think that's actually the most helpful way as I've wrestled with it. It is long, intense, and intricate. And for those of you that like lots of notes and lots of intricate, you're going to be just as happy as can be. For the rest, here's what I'd like to encourage you with. Hold on and listen a little differently. Do not worry about the details. Just worry that there are details. Because the point of this passage ultimately is going to be how detailed God's sovereign control and work is in this world. And I don't have to keep all those things clear in my head to be able to see, wow, that's pretty amazing what God did. And we, as followers of Jesus who followed for any period of time, are quick to affirm, yes, God is sovereign, yes, he's in control, yes, he's never taken by surprise. But sometimes seeing in the minute details of life makes it more concrete. And suddenly that grand doctrine that we believe kind of takes root in our souls. And that's my hope for this morning. And then at the end, we will also spend some time, because there's a section in there that I think has some really beautiful things to say to us to help us walk with some much more specific things as we leave here today. So just hold on, hang tight, do the best you can, and I'll do the best I can. I've actually put together a PowerPoint so that it's a little easier to track with, which I hate doing PowerPoint. So you know how much I love you, and you also know how complicated this is. Now, this week I had the opportunity to go to a little mini conference, and the title of the conference, I want to read this because it's long, is The Church's Mission in This Cultural Moment, subtitle, How Churches and Pastors Can Navigate Our Cultural Convulsion. Now, that's a lot of words, but it was a great conference, and I think it spoke to some really critical things. I don't know how you look at the world around us, but I think it is not unfair to say that there is a cultural convulsion going on. And how we as Christians respond, how we live in this time, is really critical. And if we're honest and look around at the big picture, we haven't always done very well in this particular cultural convulsive moment. And I loved the conference because it was led by a leading voice that I have long resonated with. Thought he was really great, one of my favorite voices on describing and characterizing what's going on and giving us insight. And then he recently, I'll throw him under the bus here, he recently became the Dean of Talbot School of Theology. So now you know who I'm talking about, and now you also know he's very much in our tribe. And one of the reasons I loved being there is because the stuff he said sounded an awful lot like stuff I had been saying. And it just automatically resonated. It's not that I have all this great wisdom and everything figured out, but I've wrestled with things, and when you see things that you kind of go, I think this is what's going on, and somebody else who's very insightful says the same stuff, it's like, yes, that's so helpful. And so I found it really, really helpful. And he talked about a lot of different things that are going on and dynamics in church. One of the things that he pointed out that I thought was very interesting to capture is that once upon a time, the things that churches wrestled with, the things that we argued over, fought about, whatever, were theological. That is, the ultimate, the primary realities, the primary truths. Or they were methodological. And if you think deeply about methodological things, what you realize is it's actually a question about how well are we doing with the mission God has given us. So those are both really, really important things. And there's still things that we can wrestle with there, but what's happening more and more in our day and age is the issues are ideological. They are not the primary things. Some of them are important, but they're secondary things that are elevated to primary position, often at the cost of what is primary. And what that's doing is not helping. It is not helping the church, and it's not helping the church with the cultural convulsion that we're in, because when hard things happen, we need to be positioned rightly in God. And one of the things that's come up, and he kind of highlighted this, and it's stuff that I have been concerned about for some time, is a lot of the struggle isn't all of the things that we're wrestling with, it's a flaw in our spiritual formation. Somewhere within who we have become and who we have been becoming, something got off, and we've been focused on the wrong things and growing things the wrong way or not growing in other ways. And it's just there's something broken in there that needs to come out. And when the pressure gets up, when things get really hard, that's when what is below the surface comes out. That's when we can see who we really are, how we really think, and how we really respond. And that picture is helpful because it shows us what we need to be growing in, but it can also be a little discouraging. And the challenge is that we're always heading into something hard. That's not being kind of negative, that's just being honest. Right, and that's not reading like the signs of the times, here's the terrible thing that's coming. It's like, no, that's a sign of every single time. We have lived in a season that has been remarkable for the grace that we've experienced in so much freedom and release from so many pressures. That's the unusual thing. And when we track how history has gone, when we listen to the Word of God with any kind of consistency, we see that there's always this cycle. Sinful people go in bad directions, and sinful leaders who have power take the world in bad directions, and they exploit the other sinful people, and it's not a good picture. And the question that we have to deal with is, how equipped am I for that? How prepared am I to live faithfully and fruitfully in really hard things? And that's actually the central thing that Daniel is going to get to in chapter 11. So we have a whole lot of context that's going to flesh it out, and we're going to go through all of that context. And what I want you to notice is, whether you pick up on the specifics of the detail or not, that there is a lot of detail, and that detail is incredibly accurate. That God has spoken in Daniel's day. And chapter 11, the things he's describing unfold over the next 100, 200, 300, 400 years. And the way he describes it is uncanny. So, buckle up, let's do this, and then when we finish going through the meat of the text, then we'll really drill down into what I think is really helpful. There's multiple things that he said, but I think at the end we're going to have three key strategies, if you will. Three key strategies for being prepared for hard things, or for if I'm in the hard thing as a result of following Jesus. But if I'm in the midst of the hard thing, these three things will help me. They will help sustain me and carry me, and so it'll be well worth our time. But let's jump in first. Daniel 11, which is really about war and intrigue, and it starts off this way. As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now, Charlie actually talked about that last week in his sermon because it's really part of that passage. Chapters 10 through 12 are one long section, and the chapter marks were dropped in. So there's no real break. Chapter 11, verse 1, it's the angel saying, this vision happens in about 536 BC. He's describing something in 538 BC. He's saying that's when the struggle began, and I've been struggling since then. And then he goes on in verse 2. It's an angel talking to Daniel to help him understand what God's doing. Now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he's become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Okay, what are we talking about? Well, Darius the Mede, I've told you already, I think is another name for Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is the original emperor. And either Darius is one of his key lieutenants who's ruling on his behalf, or it is another name for Cyrus, and I think that's the more likely scenario. So he's the first one. And then after him come Cambyses, who nobody cared about except his family. Smerdis, they cared even less about him except his family. Darius the First, who really is important. If you ever look at Persian history, they will always talk about him. He's a super significant emperor. And then Xerxes, who is also a super significant emperor. So with what we're saying here is the 4th one is going to be super wealthy, and he's going to stir things up against the kingdom of Greece. And we come to Xerxes. Xerxes is 100 years after this prophecy. Xerxes is, in fact, an incredibly powerful emperor. Xerxes, by the way, shows up in the book of Esther. That's Mr. Esther. Ahasuerus, if you have an older translation, or Xerxes, if you have one that's shifted the spelling. But either way, that's the guy we're talking about. But he's not just important in the biblical narrative, he's important in the whole narrative of history. And he is, in fact, the Persian that said, hey, why don't we take Greece? That would be cool. That's kind of a cool place. You know, you get Socrates and you get those cool little cabbage roll things. And I mean, it's good. Let's take Greece. Right? And so he's the guy that all the battles, he's the bad guy in all the battles, if you like all those movies, like 300 and whatever. You know, when somebody says to Leonidas, lay down your arms, and Leonidas says, come and take them, he's talking to Xerxes. And don't miss the fact that Xerxes did come and take them, by the way. That's why we have the story, because Leonidas and all of his buddies are dead. Xerxes crushed them. Another soldier in that battle, another one of the Spartans is said, you know, somebody was saying, you know, when the Persians launch their arrows, it will blot out the sun. And he kind of wryly said, then we'll fight in the shade. Because Spartans are bad dudes. But all those Spartans are dead dudes because Xerxes just flattened them. Right? And he's the one who stirred up the animosity between Greece and Persia. In fact, that's animosity that Alexander the Great, 100 years after that, capitalizes on to mobilize people to help him conquer Persia, and that's where we're going next. All of this is way after Daniel's time, and God's given him details that are pretty explicit. They get way more explicit as we go. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. But not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. Now we're talking about Alexander the Great, who did as he willed, right? That's kind of Daniel's code for saying, yep, he's one of these arrogant rulers that thinks he's in charge, but God's actually in charge. And Alexander dies on campaign as he's building his empire. And his kingdom does not go to his sons. It gets divided, and there's a group called the Diadochi, which is the successors, and it's a group of his generals that kind of half battle for and half parlay for the kingdom, and they split it up. They split it up into 4 big groups: Macedonia, Babylon, and later Babylon, Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt, right? So literally, this king that's being talked about 200 years before the fact dies. He has no heirs to the throne that get the throne. In fact, it's divided up amongst other people, and it's scattered to the 4 winds of the earth, to the north, the south, the east, and the west. That's roughly how they partitioned the kingdom. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. Now, we just read that and go, okay. And Daniel would go, you're an angel, I'm listening, whatever. I don't understand what you mean. But when we put the template of history over that, it suddenly pops very clear. The king of the south is a guy who winds up ruling in Egypt. His name is Ptolemy the First. He's first called the satrap of Egypt, which would be like a governor of sorts, but then he names himself king. He puts his capital at Alexandria. The guy who's originally the satrap of Babylon is Seleucus, another one of the kings, another one of the generals. But in all the tussle and struggle, some of the other Diadochi kick him out, and he runs to Egypt to save his life. And he winds up, instead of being the ruler of Babylon, he winds up being a key general under the Egyptian ruler, Ptolemy. And then over time, he distinguishes himself, and Ptolemy says, let's get your rule back. And so together they go kick out the guy that's taken over Babylon, and now he becomes Seleucus the First, and he's named the king of the north. Eventually their capital moves to Antioch. But he becomes super powerful. He expands that kingdom so much that it runs all the way out to India. He's this very powerful king. He's stronger, in fact, than his benefactor was. And he moves his capital to Antioch, which is important because Antioch is due north of Israel, and Alexandria, Egypt, is essentially due south of Israel. So if those two groups are going to interact at all, guess who they're running right over the top of? So every time north-south stuff goes on, Israel's smack in the middle of that. After some years, okay, this is important to catch here. God is not trying to give us all of the details to fill in for our history final exam. He's trying to give us some details that will show a pattern so that he can talk about what he wants to talk about. And so there are gaps in this that Daniel may or may not have understood, but we look at it and go, oh, wait, we've shifted. Not necessarily the text, but you look at history and go, oh, wait, that didn't happen. Oh, that happened here, right? So there's these skips. And one is right here. After some years, they make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. It's like, what does that mean? Well, Antiochus the second is the king of the north. And he's the grandson of Seleucus II, right? So we've skipped some generations. Down in the south, Ptolemy II is ruling still, and he gives his daughter, Berenice, to Antiochus to get married and to establish a nice little treaty between the two kingdoms. So as a result of that, Antiochus says to Berenice, you will be the royal consort. He had more than one wife. And he said, you're the favorite now. You're the one, your son's going to be on the throne, which was great news to Berenice, and it was fine for Antiochus, and that's exactly what Ptolemy was looking for. But there's another woman in the picture. He's got a wife he's already promised that to, and her name is Laodice, and she doesn't like it, and she takes matter into her own hands, and she poisons her husband, and she stages a coup, and after the dust all settles, her son winds up on the throne. And suddenly, somehow, Berenice and her son are dead. Right? Now, those details we get from history, but you read the Daniel story and you go, that's exactly what it says. I mean, it wasn't so obvious looking at it the first time, but you go, oh, look back. Yes, that's exactly what it says. And then there's war between the north and the south. And from a branch from her roots, right, from Berenice's family, one shall arise in his place, in the place of his father. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal with them, and shall prevail, and he shall also carry off to Egypt their gods, and their metal images, and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. So now we've got a battle. The king in the south doesn't like what's happened to his sister. He doesn't like what's happened to the plan that his father made, so now he goes on the rampage. He goes up north. He has some victory, and a historian tells us he actually takes 2,500 metal idols and cups and so on that were used in the worship back to Egypt with him. And then he kind of calms down for a little bit, right? This happens. Ptolemy III, Berenice's brother, who dominates, and Seleucus II, who's the son of Antiochus II. We're just going down through the history, and generation after generation, God's nailing it. This is exactly how it's going to unfold. Then The latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south. So the guy up north doesn't like it. Now he's coming down. He's going to get revenge, but he's going to return to his own land. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. So he's going to try to do war. It's not going to go very well, but his sons are going to come along behind him. They're going to raise a huge army. They're going to take it to the very gates of Egypt. And that's what's going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. The two sons that we know from history are Seleucus III and Antiochus III, who do exactly what was described hundreds of years after it was described. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hands. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. What's going on? Well, now the guy from Egypt doesn't like it. He goes up, he wins some pretty big victories, he gets pretty cocky, but at home, he's not actually Egyptian, right? He's this Greek import that's been ruling Egypt, and the Egyptians get upset and they try to overthrow their overlords. And it kind of opens this extended period of unrest in Egypt, and that's where he casts down tens of thousands back in Egypt. And that's the story. Ptolemy IV defeats Antiochus III at a place called Raphia. We have the details of the battle. And he goes home to quash a rebellion in Egypt. Keep going. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south. He still has trouble within the kingdom. And the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. So there'll be some of the Jewish people who jump on board with this battle, and here's what's going on. Antiochus III from the north gains the upper hand. Some Jews join up with what's going on, and then the part we don't know is a bit about that prophecy or vision, and what probably that means is somebody during that time stands up and gives a false prophecy, which was not at all uncommon, saying, hey, here's our opportunity, let's join up and let's go beat up on Ptolemy. And it doesn't work. So, keep going. The king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So here's the king of the north who's really doing well, and nobody's able to stand against him, and he winds up in Palestine, in Israel, and nobody can stand against him. But there's this stuff about the well-fortified city and the troops of the king of the south, and what's going on there? Well, the king of the south at this point is a boy. And so he has a key man who's running Egypt for him, and he has a key general who's running the troops for him. And that's why it's worded a little bit awkwardly, because he's not leading his troops, it's his general who is, and they're up in northern Palestine, north of the Sea of Galilee, having a battle, and it doesn't go well. And the commander of the king of the south's army has enough army left that he runs to the closest fortified city, which is the city of Sidon. Tyre and Sidon you've heard of from the Old Testament. Very important city. And when Antiochus hears that, he goes over, he chases him, he sets siege, and he takes over, right? So that's all characterized there. Antiochus III, who's called the Great because of his political exploits, he's successful. He wrests Palestine from Ptolemy V. Palestine, the land of Israel, used to mostly be with Egypt. Now it's going to mostly be with Syria, Babylon. Scopas, who's Ptolemy's general, who probably had really good breath, I'm assuming. He's married to Lysterinus, maybe, I don't know. He's defeated at a place called Peneus, north of the Sea of Galilee, 200 BC. And then there's the siege of Sidon. So this stuff is all talked about. Let's see, 200, that would be 336 years after these words are given. It unfolds with that detail. He shall set his face to come, this is the king of the north again, Antiochus III. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. What is that talking about? Well, not only are these guys political rivals, they're now intermarried households. So Antiochus' nephew at some level is the guy that's ruling in Egypt. And when he beats him up and takes away his army, he says, but hey, let's make nice here. How about if I give you a daughter to marry and we'll restore our relationship? Only he doesn't mean anything good by this. And here's how it unfolds. Antiochus gives his daughter Cleopatra, not that Cleopatra. That Cleopatra's great aunt or something like that. He gives her in marriage to Ptolemy V, and he probably intends that as cover to then invade Egypt. But Cleopatra decides she likes her husband more than her dad. Good for her, by the way, ladies. When you get married, it's your husband, right? This is dad telling you that. So she sides with her husband over her dad, and then the whole plot falls apart. We're told that in detail 300 and some years prior. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands. This is Antiochus III, and shall capture many of them. So the king of the north is going back up because that didn't work down in Egypt. So now he takes it out elsewhere. But a commander, not a king, a commander, some other person, notice that detail, shall put an end. He turns in his insolence back. Hold on. Commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back towards the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Right? So Antiochus III is going on battles, and then somebody stops it, and he humiliates him, and he goes home, and then a battle breaks out, and he goes and fights that war. That's exactly what happens. Antiochus fails to take Egypt because of the Romans. There's a new big kid on the block, and they don't like what the north and the south are doing, and they come in and stop it. And there is an intervention under Scipio. Right, he's the Roman commander. He sounds more like a preppy from the 1980s, but he is a Roman commander of some particular valor and merit, and he stops Antiochus, and he actually forces him to sign a treaty with some pretty humiliating terms to it. And so Antiochus, who's been pretty cocky, is now humiliated. And when he gets home, there's a new battle that breaks out on a different front with the Elamites, and he is killed in that battle. Right? All of that's given to us hundreds of years prior by God. And then shall arise in his place, in place of Antiochus III, an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. Now, this isn't a king, but somebody is like a tax man, right? The king is replaced by a tax man? It doesn't make sense. But within a few days, he'll be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Just doesn't say what happens. We don't know what happens to him. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, that's a lot of weird detail for hundreds and hundreds of years prior, and that's exactly how it worked out. Here's what happened. When Antiochus is killed, his son, Seleucus IV, becomes the king. He doesn't do a whole lot because his dad has essentially bankrupted the realm. And so he elects or chooses, he picks, doesn't elect, he picks, he appoints a tax man, a guy named Heliodorus, who is particularly competent and particularly cruel, to go and squeeze out as much money as possible. And Heliodorus is pretty good at his job, and he does that, and he says, you know what, I think I could run the kingdom better than Seleucus. And so he goes back to Antioch and assassinates Seleucus and takes over. Only he doesn't put himself on the throne. He puts Seleucus' son on the throne, who's a boy, and he figures I'll just kind of maneuver and manipulate the boy. And while this is going on, there's another guy in the picture. Seleucus IV's brother is Antiochus IV. Part of the humiliating treaty with Antiochus III is one of your sons will be in hostage. And at first that's Antiochus IV, and then they trade him later for another son. And so when Antiochus III dies, there's a son in captivity in Rome. There's Antiochus IV, who after he got out, he doesn't go home. He just kind of hangs out in Greece for a while. And there's Seleucus IV, the son who's in Antioch. He becomes the king. Well, when Heliodorus assassinates him, Antiochus IV, the brother, sees his opportunity. He is not in the throne line. He is a royal prince, but he is not part of the king line. His nephew is sitting on the throne. And so somehow, mysteriously, Heliodorus disappears, and through a lot of intrigue, Antiochus winds up being co-regent with his nephew. Hey, buddy, let me help you out. Why don't we be kings together? We'll be the Seleucid kings, you and me. And that works out fine until Antiochus is satisfied he's got everything he needs, and then kills his nephew and takes over the throne. That's why he's called a contemptible man, right? That's Antiochus IV. We also know him, let's keep reading. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him, broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. He shall become strong with a small people. Antiochus IV takes the name Epiphanes, the one who reveals glory, the bright one, whatever, and they call him Epimanes, which means the crazy madman. They don't call him that to his face, though. And he is so wicked and so arrogant, he actually serves as a type of Antichrist. In Daniel, it toggles back and forth between Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Antichrist from the end of time, because Antiochus captures so much of who Antichrist is. He's like this perfect picture of him. He's a baby Antichrist, if you will. Really wicked, horrible man. Prince of the Covenant is killed. We're not sure who that is. It may not be the Holy Covenant, which would be a Jewish leader. It could just be covenant. It could be his nephew. He makes a covenant with his nephew when he comes in and co-rules and kills him. Or it could be the high priest of that era is a guy named Onias III, who appears to have been assassinated, and Antiochus would be behind that. It doesn't matter. He's a bad guy. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. He shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. So he is a total political animal. He will use violence, he will use force, he will use intimidation, he will use cunning, he will use bribery, he'll use anything. Here's gifts, here's a sword, whatever. I'm going to come out on top. And that's the way Antiochus rules, by intrigue, treachery, and violence. The king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. For plots shall be devised against him. Again, he's got fractures from within. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, that's the king of the south, who's not doing so well, and Antiochus IV, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table. They'll be there kind of pretending to make nice. Remember, they are distant relatives, pretending to make nice, but they're all going to be plotting to outmaneuver each other. And they'll do that to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. There's a nod to God's ultimately in control no matter what they're doing. Right? So what do we see here? Ptolemy IV, Antiochus' nephew, loses to his uncle at Mount Cassius in 170 BC. And his benevolent nephew says, let me take you under my wing and make you my protege, which is ridiculous. He's trying to maneuver. And there's a lot of intrigue that goes on. So the king of the north, we're tracking with him right now, shall return to his land with great wealth. He gets that wealth going through Israel on the way back from Egypt to Antioch. He stops at the local temple and says, I'll take all of that, please. And everything else he can lay his hands on. And his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. That's clearly the Jewish covenant. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw. So, at the time appointed, again, God's in control. Antiochus plunders the temple on his way back to Antioch. He has a new invasion of Egypt, and it's again thwarted by those pesky Romans. And this time they have a guy that sounds like he should be selling things on infomercials, Popilius. And Popilius is another very capable Roman commander, and Antiochus has actually laid siege to Alexandria. And Popilius comes in and he says, Mom, I don't like this. You need to go home. Go to your room. I don't want to do that. I'm not asking, I'm telling. Well, Antiochus is trying to figure out how much does he have to listen to this guy. And so he says to Popilius, give me a few hours to talk to my advisors, and I will give you an answer. And Popilius says, and he grabs a piece of chalk, and he draws a circle on the floor around Antiochus. He says, you don't come out of that circle until you've made your choice. Okay, so Antiochus says, all right, I'll leave. Well, he's really, really mad, right? He's been totally humiliated. Rome won't let him do it. Those nasty Romans won't let him do what he wants to do. And so he leaves humiliated and angry right through Israel. He'll turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He'll turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. These are all things that Antiochus does on his way back through, and the important ones to track with is in the temple of God, he sets up an altar to Zeus, and then he sacrifices a pig. Like the ultimate abomination. He is that arrogant. He, Antiochus, shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, in other words, those who've compromised. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. Doesn't sound like a very fun activity list, right? Sword, flame, captivity, plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. God is still in control, right? So there's a lot there, and we're going to unpack that verse just a little bit more. So just quickly, seduction is there and compromise. He's wooing and winning and lying. He's just a trickster, and some people buy it, and they follow. And then there's faithfulness and persecution for those who don't. And then maybe there's a nod to the Maccabees. I mentioned them a couple of weeks ago. They're a group of Jewish freedom fighters. Maccabee is a nickname for hammer. That shows you what kind of people they were. Maybe they're the ones who give a little bit of help. But one of the things that we see here is that this is all carefully timed by God, and there's that statement that says some of the people who are suffering like this, it is in order to refine and purify them. And that's a nod, that's a reminder to say, hey, one of the things Daniel's been telling us is God has his reasons. When hard things happen, God has his reasons. He's working out something that's important and worthy. And he reminds us of that here again. Now something happens. Verse 36 and beyond seems to be another big jump. There's subtle clues in the Hebrew text that the scholars point out that are too subtle to even bring out here. So I will point out something that's a little bit more obvious. There has to be a shift. Remember, we have these gaps, and it doesn't always tell us when. We just kind of jump. There has to be a shift that we're going to see in chapter 12, which is still part of this same flow. But let's read this first. The king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods, shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. And then it flows on. Here's how chapter 12 goes. It says, here's what I think. I think this is a shift to the Antichrist. I think everything from verse 36 to the end is about Antichrist. So, in chapter 12, it says, at that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's clearly the end of time. So it appears that we have jumped now to the Antichrist, and I'll just pick up where the flow ended. The Antichrist then would honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, precious stones, costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign God. Those who acknowledge him he'll load with honor. He'll make them rulers over many, shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen with many ships. And he shall come into the countries and shall overflow and pass through, and he shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fail or shall fall. But these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom, Moab, the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries. The land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans, the Cushites will follow in his train. News from the east and the north will alarm him. He'll go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. I think all of that's about the Antichrist and the battles that take place and what happens at the end of time, which we don't have time to unpack here. But up through verse 35, it has been stuff that we can look back on and say God gave incredible detail, and it happened exactly the way that he described. Daniel hears this in 536 BC, and the last verses are around 163, 164 BC, before we jump into the future from our vantage point. And God nails it. He nails it all. And I think that's important to just stop for a minute and remind ourselves that God rules, God wins, God's in control, God's always working his plan. He knows what he's doing. Nothing takes him by surprise. Nothing is outside of his control. Nothing is outside of his plan ultimately, right? He's working things out. And in my life, that doesn't always feel that way. It doesn't always seem that way. And those overarching truths can help me. But here we've got this extended discourse of this happened, this happened, this happened. I'm telling you before it happens. Because that's the kind of control God exercises. And I think meditating on that can really be an encouragement to me and to you for future faith and for future faithfulness. And I would encourage you to just let that sit with you as you walk away this morning. The level of detail, even though you don't remember it, you don't have to. It doesn't matter. You could look it up in a history book. It's there, but it doesn't matter. God tells Daniel this long before it happens because God is in absolute control. When he tells me something, it will happen because he's in absolute control. I want to focus just for a minute on this passage when it talks about Antiochus, and I'm going to cut straight to the subpoints here because these are all drawn from that text. In that section where it talks about Antiochus and how he interacts in Israel, it starts by saying he seduces with flattery. There's a lot of people who compromise, right? Daniel is given this prophecy to help prepare people so that when the hard thing comes, they're actually ready. They're ready to walk and ready to stand and ready to be faithful, but some of them don't. And one reason is this. He seduces them. Don't think in terms of sexuality. Think in terms of slick, tricky. Well, think in terms of this. Charlie unpacked for us last week that the stuff that's going on here is also connected with the stuff that's going on in the spiritual realm. Satan is at work. Satan is always at work. He was at work back then. He's at work now, and he has many of the same devices. And he is the liar and the father of lies. He is the deceiver. He is the slanderer. He is the one who disguises himself as an angel of light. He loves to take God's people and get them off track. He loves to seduce their minds. One of the saddest verses I find in Scripture is in Timothy, where Paul is saying to him, Demas has forsaken me. Demas, who was my friend, Demas, who was my ministry partner, Demas, who helped plant churches, who was a missionary, has walked away. And the reason he walked away is because he fell in love with this present world. What happened? He was seduced. How do I know that? 1 John Chapter 2 says, don't love the world or the things that are in the world. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life. The stuff that is pleasurable, the stuff that is exciting to look at, the stuff that makes me feel good about my status or my power. All those things, the stuff that I have, my significance wrapped up in the wrong place, that's not of the Father, it's of the world, and the world is passing away. That's a seduction of Satan. It's very explicit. In 1 John 5, verse 19, it says the world lies in his lap. He's the one who's doing that. That's exactly what he did with Eve in the garden. He seduced her, and she followed. He tries to seduce Jesus. His arguments, if you look at them, he's using exactly the same entry points that he used with Eve, that he uses with you and me, that John calls out in 1 John chapter 2. There is a seduction that the whole world system is constantly perpetrating, and it can grab me. It grabbed Demas, who was a missionary partner of the Apostle Paul. Who do I think I am? He's telling them, be careful. These things can seduce you, can pull you off track. Who's discipling you? That's really important. In the conference this week, one of the things he said is, I think one of the challenges, why we have such challenges in our spiritual formation is really a lot of people are being discipled by their broadcast news source or by their social media watering holes. And I think we could expand that out to say, or a particular friend group or family culture that's not lined up with God. There are things that constantly disciple and shape us. And in those things, if they are not rooted in God, is a seduction. So I have to ask myself, where am I vulnerable to seduction? Because Satan is still a seducer. Here's the second thing I wanted to call out. People who know their God shall stand firm and take action. It's people who know their God, not people who know about their God. Not people who know the principles their God gave in order to navigate life. Not people who serve their God or obey their God. Those are all part of the package, but he drives through those things to anchor it in something relational. Because the reality is, it's easy. It's easy to turn my walk with Jesus into not a walk with Jesus, a walk with some principles, some guidelines, some ideals. And then I live those things out in my own strength. And when something really hard comes along, there is no way I am strong enough for that. Or I think those things out with my own cleverness, and when something very confusing and seductive comes along, I get swept away. I need to be anchored to Christ himself. I need to be anchored to God himself. When David passes the baton to Solomon, he says, get to know the God of your ancestors. When Isaiah is warning the people who are running away from God, he says, don't let the rich man boast in his riches. Don't let the wise man boast in his wisdom. Don't let the strong man boast in his strength. If you want to boast, boast in this, that you understand and know me. When Jesus is praying, he lays out the nub of what salvation actually is, what eternal life actually is, in very succinct terms in John 17. He says, this is eternal life, knowing you, Father, and knowing me. That's what eternal life is. It's this relational connection. All those other things matter, but they're anchored by something bigger than that. We don't follow a system. A system will not stand up, but a God will. Anchored to God. When Paul is talking about his own history, he talks about how he once had such zeal. See, that's the thing. We can follow the system and think we're following God, and we're not. Paul had such zeal so that he was persecuting the church. This is Philippians 3. Read it when you have a chance. And he says, all that stuff is just garbage. Here's what I really want. I want to know him. That's Philippians 3. And here in Daniel, we're told it's those who know their God. They're the ones who are equipped. They're the ones who are prepared. They're the ones who can stand. What am I doing? that is pursuing not just God's things, but pursuing knowing God, responding to him personally, anchoring there. It's not always easy. A God who is not physically present is not easy quarry sometimes. That's okay. It's always the right question to keep coming back to, anchoring in that. Those whys will help many to understand. And then the last one I wanted to point out is some of the whys will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white. And here's where we have to come back to one of the key lessons in Daniel is I have to trust God's reasons. Hard things are going to happen. Can I find God in them? Now, we can say that glibly, which is cruel and unbiblical, right? There are things that happen that are horrific. They are unconscionable, and we do have to address those and deal with those. And there's a lot of pain, and a lot of question, a lot of struggle, a lot of things we will never fully understand. But underneath that, undergirding it all, is the reality that we do serve a God who is ultimately in control. And whether I find it baffling or utterly unthinkable what's happening in my life, somewhere in this, God is at work. And he's at work to do me good. He meant that when he said that the sufferings of this present time aren't worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed. He meant that when he said all things do work together for good. He meant that. And he's working that out. And most of us, I suspect, have lived long enough to see this dynamic. The suffering and the struggle and the hardship that you and I experience as we follow Jesus, right, is some of the most fruitful and precious stuff that's ever happened. Even though I would never do that again. You could not pay me enough to do that again, but I wouldn't trade it for what happened in me. God is shaping a beautiful soul in the midst of an ugly world, right? And that's when I am gentled. That's when I am humbled in the best biblical sense. That's when my vision and values are clarified and when I get what really matters. That's when I'm anchored in God, just raw anchored in him. Not what he does, I have you and that's all I got and that's ultimately all I'm gonna need, right? There's stuff that happens in my soul through that hard journey that God does something beautiful. And that's what he's promising here. He's saying, those people that are stumbling, part of the journey is to purify and to refine and to make white. And it doesn't make the hard thing beautiful, but it makes it serve what is beautiful. And that's really the only option I have anyway. I can't take away the hard thing. If God hasn't chosen to, that's the path I've got. But in the midst of that, he can do something really extraordinary in me. And that's what he wants to do. So that's the question. Hard stuff comes. Am I prepared? I'm going to pray, ask the ushers to come. Lord, thank you for your grace. There's so much that you have given us here. It makes our heads throb. But through it all, we just see this refrain. You're in control, you're in control, you're in control. And you make things work the way that they ultimately should. We do not understand, Lord, why it has to be so hard sometimes. But you've given us preparation, and so we want to lean into that, Lord. And I pray for each one. I don't know where we each are on our journey, Lord. You do. Meet us there in your grace. Anchor us in our relationship with you, that we would know our God. Help us not to be seduced by the false messages that sound so attractive but are so poisonous. And help us to understand and actually trust that you do good things through it all. As we give these gifts, Lord, I pray that you would use them for the sake of your name in this world. In Jesus' name, amen.